All right, it appears we have the go-ahead. I'm going to record this on my end. Maybe. Counsel, can you both hear me?
Yes, sir.
Are you aware whether I should be the one recording this or whether someone else is?
Your Honor, I believe the bailiff will be recording the trial. Ms. Falkenstein, I believe.
I see that now, and the bailiff's told me he or she will be doing that. Okay, great. Counsel, I think everybody's here, so I'm going to call the case of the United States v. Kara Bassett. I'm Judge Jacob Morse. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons in the lower left of your screen and turn off your audio and video. It appears everyone's done that capably. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. I'm going to let everybody go ahead and handle that. Okay. This means that only the people on the screen right now should be the two advocates and myself. Can attorneys please go ahead and make appearances for the benefit of everybody? I'll let the government start.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon from the East Coast. My name is Elias Nybart, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Mr. John Merle.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
And together we represent the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Nybart. And for defense counsel.
Hello, Your Honor. My name is Sydney Gaskins. I'm joined here today by my co-counsel, Mr. Ethan Hudson.
Hello, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Together, we represent the defendant in today's case, Ms. Kara Bassett.
Okay. I'm sorry, for the government, your co-counsel's last name again?
Mr. Merle, Your Honor. Merle spelled M-E-R-L-E.
Okay, great. So I believe we've dispensed with all evidentiary issues and we are to proceed with opening statements. Is that counsel's understanding of how we're proceeding from here? Is there anything else?
Just a couple of pretrial matters from the prosecution, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
First, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, which calls for the constructive sequestration of all witnesses, barring the party representatives, and the government will know that we don't have a party representative in today's proceedings.
Okay, as you know, that rule is a mandatory rule of which I do not have discretion and will be allowed such that all witnesses are, at least for the purposes of this trial, constructively sequestered. Ms. Gaskins, do you have a party representative or anyone else who will be remaining in the courtroom?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Bassett will be here for her trial today.
Okay, so Ms. Bassett will be allowed to stay. Other than that, the only persons in the courtroom are going to be the witness on the stand and counsel and the jurors and myself. Okay, anything else from the government?
Yeah, one final matter, Your Honor. The state would like to note that exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted, and they can be discussed at trial without further foundation or testimony.
Ms. Gaskins, would you like to be heard on that?
No, Your Honor, that's our understanding as well.
Okay, 4 through 33 are pre-admitted. It's my understanding that the remainder of the exhibits have been stipulated as authentic, such that there's no issue of authenticity here at trial. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Yes, Your
Okay.
Honor.
Anything else?
That's all from the government.
Defense?
Nothing else, Your Honor. We're ready to go.
Okay. So we're now going to hear opening statements. Everyone should make sure they are now in speaker view, such that your camera will automatically focus on the person whose audio is picking stuff up. That button is at the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And with that, I'll let the government proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, Ms. Gaskins, members of the jury, she had enough. Today you're going to hear that the defendant finally had enough. Members of the jury, in 2011, the defendant, Kara Bassett, married a man named Don Clark. See, Don and Kara, they shared a unique interest. They both had a passion and love for one thing: elephants. So in 2011, they opened up their own elephant park in Tallahassee, Florida. But members of the jury, today you're going to hear that there was a problem. See, Don, he ran the park, and he viewed it as a business. He wanted the animals to be in cages. He wanted to charge admission. He wanted to make money. But Kara, on the other hand, she had a different philosophy. Kara wanted to run an animal sanctuary, not a zoo. She wanted the animals to roam freely. She prioritized the elephant's well-being over profit. Members of the jury, today you're going to hear that time and time again, the defendant asked her husband to change the zoo to an animal sanctuary. Time and time again, her husband said no. Time and time again, the defendant's husband told her, we're running a business, not a charity. And members of the jury, today you're going to hear that the defendant finally had enough. She began to devise a plan to get her husband out of the picture, a plan to take control of the elephant park. And members of the jury, on August 18th of 2017, the defendant followed through with that plan. On that day, the defendant murdered her own husband because she finally had enough. And that's why the government has charged Miss Bassett with murder. And now all we have to prove is that Kara Bassett killed her husband and did so because she possessed some ill will or hatred towards him. And we have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that's a high burden, but it's one we intend to meet. And we're going to meet it by showing you how and why the defendant committed this crime. So first, the how. Well, today you're going to hear from Agent Stephen Johnson, the lead investigator in today's case. And Agent Johnson's going to walk you through exactly what happened on August 18th of 2017. He'll tell you that the defendant, Kara Bassett, took an elephant tranquilizer from the zoo's inventory. He'll tell you that Kara Bassett used that tranquilizer to kill her husband. He'll tell you that Kara Bassett put her husband's body in the back of a van and drove it miles and miles away to get rid of it. But more importantly, members of the jury, Agent Johnson's going to tell you why the defendant committed this crime. He'll tell you that for years, Kara and Don argued about the animal sanctuary. He'll tell you that for years, Kara wanted things to change. He'll tell you that for years, Don wouldn't listen to any of Kara's changes. And members of the jury, Agent Johnson's going to tell you that 2 months before Don was murdered, Kara told her husband, "Let me run the park or I'm going to kill you." Members of the jury, you're going to see that the defendant, she finally had enough. And that's why at the end of today's trial, I'll come right here before you. I'll walk you through the evidence from today, and I'll ask that you find Miss Bassett guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Opening statement from the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. Mr. Nybart got up here and he had a lot to say about Miss Bassett. He had a lot of claims and a lot of accusations. He told you that Miss Bassett, well, she had enough. But I couldn't help but notice that Mr. Nybart is really asking you to make a leap in logic. You see, he's asking you to believe that since Miss Bassett and her husband disagreed about the way to run an animal park, that she's a cold-blooded killer. He won't be able to prove that. And we'll get to that, but first, I want to introduce you to Miss Bassett myself. Members of the jury, this is Kara Bassett. The evidence is going to show that this woman loved elephants. Mr. Nybart's right. She was passionate, and so was her husband, Don Clark. They had been married for about 7 years. They ran the elephant park together. But about 3 years ago, they were both victims to something very tragic that happened. One night when Miss Bassett was asleep, her husband disappeared and never came back. And what you're going to figure out today is that nobody, not the government, not the FBI, not Mr. Nybart, and certainly not Miss Bassett, has any idea what actually happened that night. You see, when you listen to the government's evidence, we're confident that you're actually going to have more questions than you have answers. So I want you to focus on 3 questions as you listen to the evidence presented in this trial. First, where is Don Clark? Is the government actually going to be able to prove that he's dead? Second, why didn't the government investigate any other potential possibilities? And third, where is the evidence that Kara Bassett has any link to her husband's disappearance? You see, members of the jury, when Mr. Nybart, he walked into this courtroom today, he was the one who decided to accuse Miss Bassett of killing her own husband. Now, I don't have to tell you that that's a serious allegation. It's certainly not something to play about. And it's not just a high burden. That's why the law requires them to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, because it's actually the highest burden in our criminal justice system. And Mr. Nybart, he's not going to be able to meet that burden today. Now, we don't have a burden, but we are going to bring a witness. Today, we're going to call to the stand Joe Kwong. Joe Kwong is a TV producer. He was making a documentary about the elephant park, starring Don and Kara, called Elephant Queen. And he's going to tell you some very important things about the FBI investigation in this case. First, you're going to learn something really interesting. You're going to learn that Mr. Kwong had over 2,000 hours of video footage about the two of them leading up to the disappearance, and the FBI, well, they never even bothered to investigate it. Second, you're going to hear from Mr. Kwong that he knows about some other potential suspects, people who were in contact with the victim the day of his disappearance. That the government, they didn't even bother to investigate. Now we know. Sometimes it's tempting that when you see somebody in a defendant's chair, you want to assume that maybe they did something wrong to get them to where they are. But Miss Bassett, she walked into this courtroom with something different than the government. She walked in with something called the Presumption of Innocence. And what that means is when you find that there are gaps in the government's case, and there's many, when you have unanswered questions about what might have really happened the night that Don Clark disappeared, you have to presume that Ms. Bassett is innocent. And what this case is really going to come down to, and what I'm going to ask you to remember at the end of today's trial when I speak with you again, is that the government chose their answer before they asked the questions. I'm going to ask you to find Ms. Bassett not guilty of murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gaskins. So before we begin with the government's case in chief, I will ask that everyone switch to gallery view. This button is in the upper right of your screen and will allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. With that, Mr. Nybart, the jury's with you.
Yes, Your Honor. This time, the government calls Agent Stephen Johnson to the stand.
Mr. Johnson, I'll remind you, you've been sworn and you're under oath. And You have the obligation to tell the truth. Mr. Nybert, you can proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you state your name for the court?
Special Agent Stephen Johnson.
Agent Johnson, what do you do for a living?
I'm a special agent with the FBI.
Can you tell the jury about your experience in law enforcement?
Yes, I started with the FBI in 2002, and after about a decade of work in 2012, I was promoted to senior special agent. With my work with the FBI, I usually work in the violent crimes division, working with rapes, murders, crimes of that sort.
Now, Agent, how are you involved in today's case?
Well, I was tasked with investigating a missing persons report, a man named Don Clark, a zookeeper from Tallahassee. He was reported missing about 6 days after his disappearance by his wife, Cara Bassett.
Was Mr. Clark ever found?
Unfortunately, no. Officers were never able to actually find Mr. Clark. In fact, with the evidence that we gathered, we started to suspect a potential homicide in this case.
Well, Agent, why did you believe that Mr. Clark was murdered?
Well, with our investigation and talking to witnesses, we begin to suspect that there may have been involvement by Mr. Clark's wife, Ms. Cara Bassett.
Well, Agent, what exactly did you find that suggested Miss Bassett was involved in this crime?
There was a clear pattern based on 3 key pieces of evidence that we found, being a GPS coordinates of a van from the night of Dawn's disappearance, lab test of some boots recovered from the zoo, as well as a missing syringe that we found from the zoo.
All right, Agent, let's talk about those 3 pieces of evidence. Can you tell the jury a bit more about those GPS coordinates?
Of course. In investigating the zoo, we found a van that both Cara and Dawn both had access to. On the night of Dawn's disappearance, that van took a highly unusual route before ending up at an airport.
Where did the van go?
It went to a swamp about 140 miles away called Big Gum Swamp.
Now, Agent, did you prepare any materials to show the members of the jury about that van's coordinates on the night of the attack?
Absolutely. We actually recovered a map of the GPS coordinates that shows exactly what time and where the van went.
Would you recognize that map in court today?
Absolutely.
Mr. Merle, can we see that map, please? Now, Agent, what are we looking at here?
This is the map that we use to determine the GPS route taken and times from the van on the night of Dawn's disappearance. Over on the left side here, we have the Elephant Park in Greater Tallahassee, and on the right side here, it leads over to the Big Gum Swamp.
Now, Agent, what time did Mr. Clark's van leave the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park?
We determined that the van started to move away from the park at about 11:17 that night.
Now, what time did that van arrive at Big Gum Swamp?
After traveling over 130 miles, the van ended up there at about 1:30 a.m., a little bit before.
Now, Agent, did you ever ask Miss Bassett, the defendant, if she drove that truck on that evening?
Absolutely. Investigators and myself questioned Ms. Bassett a number of times about her involvement and whereabouts on the day of. However, she mentioned that she'd actually never even heard of this swamp, despite finding some evidence that was to the contrary.
Well, Agent, what do you mean?
Well, we sent in forensics teams once we noticed that the van had been there to test algae, mud, and samples from the swamp. We actually found that those samples were a perfect match to boots that belonged to Cara.
Would you recognize those boots in court today?
Yes, I would.
Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 29, please? Now, Agent, you talked a little bit about tests that were done to these boots. Can you tell the members of the jury what exactly you found on these boots when you tested them?
Right. When we recovered these boots, we noticed that it looked a lot similar to the algae from the swamp. So we had these boots sent in for testing. And we were able to discover that, in fact, that was algae that perfectly matched the mud from the swamp.
And Agent, who owned these boots?
These are the work boots used, as far as we know, only by Cara Bassett.
Now, Agent, I want to move on to that third piece of evidence, that elephant tranquilizer you mentioned a few moments ago. Can you tell the members of the jury a bit more about that?
Yes, the zoo keeps locked up and logged a number of syringes used for elephant tranquilizing.
Now, Agent, what's contained within those syringes?
Carfentanil, a very dangerous substance. It's actually used for heavier animals like elephants. However, it's very, very dangerous for humans.
Now, Agent, why do you believe that this substance, carfentanil, was related to today's case?
Well, and looking at that storage locker, as I said earlier, it's a very, very dangerous substance. And being so, it has to have a meticulous log of every single time a syringe is even taken out. We looked at that log and noted that 24 syringes were noted to be there. However, officers were only able to recover 23 syringes, meaning that one had gone missing.
Now, Agent, who had access to those syringes?
Based on the evidence we recovered and witness statements, only 4 people had access to those syringes. 2 of those being Kara and Don, the other being 2 employees from the park.
Now, Agent, of those 4 people, who was actually at the park on the night Don Clark went missing?
As far as we were able to tell, only Kara and Don by her own admission.
Now, Agent, I want to shift focus and talk about a possible motive for Don Clark's murder. Were you able to find any evidence that suggested Miss Bassett had a motive?
Well, yes, she actually told us herself. There were numerous times where she tried to tell her husband to convert the zoo into an animal sanctuary.
Well, how did Mr. Clark respond to Miss Bassett's request?
Based on Miss Bassett's responses, not very well. He seemed to only want to run the zoo as a business.
Objection to speculation.
Response, Your Honor?
All right, yes, please.
I believe the agent was basing his testimony in what he and Miss Bassett spoke about during his interrogation of Miss Bassett. Therefore, it's rationally based on his perception that these discussions or these arguments didn't go very well.
May I respond?
Yeah.
Yes, there's no foundation on the record at this point to indicate what Mr. Nybart just said. Rather, what I'm specifically objecting to is the witness's statement that Don Clark seemed to want only to run the business, the elephant park as a business. And that's textbook speculation.
I'm going to overrule because I heard a little bit of foundation that the witness had in fact heard statements from Ms. Baskins to the effect that would give him that impression, but I'll advise the witness not to testify as to what someone else might be believing. Keep it to your perceptions. So you can proceed, Mr. Nybart. That's overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent, you were telling the members of the jury about a disagreement that Don and Kara had. Did their disagreements ever escalate?
Well, absolutely. We found evidence that they would get into several arguments, sometimes fights about this, and that Don even tried to get a restraining order against his wife.
Would you recognize that restraining order in court today?
Absolutely. It's something we reviewed in the course of our investigation.
Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 34, please? Now, Agent, in this document, does it ever say why Mr. Clark tried taking out this restraining order?
Yes, specifically in the notes section where it says handwriting. He writes there that Kara once said to him to let me run the park my way or I'm gonna kill you. That stuck out as a major red flag to us.
Now, Agent, is this a fair and accurate copy of that restraining order?
Yes.
Has it been changed or altered in any way?
As far as I can tell, it has not.
Your Honor, this time the government moves Exhibit 34 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
It's admitted.
Now, Agent, after reviewing this restraining order, after noticing that tranquilizer went missing, and after recovering that GPS data, what did you do as lead investigator?
Well, to us, it seemed that there was only one logical conclusion here, and we arrested Ms. Kara Bassett for the murder of her husband.
Thank you, Agent. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Hello, Agent Johnson.
Hello.
I want to start by asking you about the search that you conducted for Don Clark, okay?
Of course.
You started your search at the property of the Bassetts.
Yes.
You searched for any blood.
Yes, ma'am. When we do a search, we try to make sure we're thorough and complete. We have forensic teams, lab teams, officers. We canvass for all blood, DNA samples, anything of the sort.
You looked for any signs of violence, right?
Of course, of course.
At the property, you didn't find any, did you?
I'm not sure what you mean.
You didn't find any signs of blood or violence at the property, did you?
Well, no, ma'am. We weren't able to find anything like that resembled a murder scene at the property, if that's what you're asking.
You also looked at Big Gump Swamp, right?
Yes, ma'am.
There you went looking for Don Clark's body, right?
Yes, ma'am.
When you went looking for Don Clark's body, you went with a team of dogs, didn't you?
Correct. There was an entire team of lab professionals and canine officers with us.
Those dogs are trained to detect a human scent, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
They're trained to find a human dead or alive, right?
Yes, they are. That's what they're trained for.
Now that Big Gum Swamp, that's 13,000 acres of property, isn't it?
Right. It's very large. That's why we had to have a number of dogs there. And even then, we were pretty sure it would be difficult to canvass the entire area.
After canvassing the entire area and searching for Don Clark, your dogs didn't find a single trace of him, did they?
Right. In the swamp, there are a number of wild animals, dangerous, like alligators. There's also deep puddles. We suspected that maybe he was deeply submerged or maybe had been dismembered.
Well, sir, I'm not asking you about any alligators. I'm simply asking you about what your dogs found. And they didn't find anything indicating that Don Clark had been at that swamp, did they?
Well, ma'am, that's what I'm telling you. And our search with the dogs, we found a number of possible solutions to this issue, that Don could have been dismembered or that he maybe had simply been drowned.
Well, sir, let me be clear. Your dogs didn't find Don Clark, did they?
No, ma'am, we were not able to recover his body.
You don't have a forensic report proving that Don Clark is dead, do you?
No, ma'am, we do not.
You don't have an autopsy report proving that Don Clark is dead?
No, ma'am, we do not. We were unable to recover his body. Subsequently, there's no autopsy.
You don't have any independent eyewitnesses who saw Don Clark die, do you?
No, ma'am.
The truth of the matter is, your team never was able to recover his body, were they?
That's right, ma'am. We believe it was either submerged or dismembered.
Yet in 2018, he was declared to be dead, right?
Right. By his wife, Kara, the first day she could, she declared him dead.
Would you say that you conducted a thorough investigation before Don Clark was pronounced dead?
Well, absolutely, but the investigation was actually still ongoing. So I wouldn't say that it was complete at that time. We were still gathering evidence.
Mr. Hudson, can you throw up on the screen what's already in evidence as Exhibit 31? Agent Johnson, you recognize this document, don't you?
Yes, ma'am. These are, I believe, phone records that we subpoenaed from Don Clark.
These are the phone records from Don Clark's cell phone that you reviewed in your investigation. Isn't that true?
Correct.
I want to zoom in on phone call number 4. Don Clark received a phone call from this number on the 18th of August, didn't he?
Yes, that's one of the phone calls he received. There are a number of phone calls that he took on the 18th of August.
And this phone call, it lasted 52 minutes long, right?
Yes, ma'am.
This phone call, the number is traced to San Jose, Costa Rica, isn't it?
Correct, ma'am.
You have no idea who this phone number belongs to, do you?
Well, no, ma'am. However, we do have a good idea. Don had a property in Costa Rica, so it wouldn't be unusual for him to get phone calls from there. We assume that he knows people.
Well, sir, let me stop you right there. My question was, you don't know who this phone number belongs to, and you don't, do you?
No, ma'am. There was no reason to look into it.
You knew that this phone call was at 6 p.m., right?
Yes, ma'am. It says there that it was at 6 p.m.
You said a moment ago that there was no reason to look into that. Well, 6 p.m., that's just a couple hours before Don Clark allegedly disappeared, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am, but that's not a reason to look into it. If there was the approximation of time was a reason to look into it, then Miss Bassett would still be our first suspect. She was the person who claims to have seen him last at 9 p.m.
Well, sir, this isn't the only phone call that Don Clark had the night he disappeared, is it?
No, it's not. As I said, he called multiple people.
Let's zoom on one of those other calls. Mr. Hudson, can you zoom in on Lisa Clark's phone call? Agent Johnson, this phone call was also the same day that Don Clark disappeared, right?
Yes, this is another one of the phone calls he took.
This phone call was from a person named Lisa Clark, right?
Yes, this is Don's ex-wife.
You have no idea why Lisa Clark made this phone call at the time that she did, do you?
I would disagree with that.
Well, sir, you never got a chance to interview Lisa Clark, did you?
No, we did not get a chance to speak to her. However, we recovered text messages directly before this phone call happened that indicated what it might have been about.
Well, sir, sure, but I'm not asking you about the text messages. I'm asking you about this phone call. And you don't know why Lisa Clark made this phone call, do you?
Well, that's what I'm disagreeing with, ma'am. Based on those text messages and the fact that they were only a few seconds before this phone call was taken, it's easy to say that this is what they were talking about.
Well, sure, but you don't know the contents of the phone call, do you?
Well, of course not, ma'am. They only spoke for 4 minutes.
And since you never interviewed Lisa Clark, you never got an alibi for where she was the night of Don Clark's disappearance, did you?
No, ma'am. There was no reason to find a possible alibi for Lisa Clark.
You never got an alibi from that caller from Costa Rica either, didn't you?
Well, no, ma'am. There would be no reason to get an alibi from someone who was out of the country during the day of the disappearance.
Well, that's a no.
No, ma'am. That would not have been helpful for our investigation.
And since you don't have an alibi for Lisa Clark, you don't know where she was the night that Don Clark disappeared. Isn't that a fact?
No, we can't tell you for sure where she was.
You don't know if she was at Don Clark's property the night that he disappeared, do you?
Actually, we can be pretty certain that she was not there.
Well, Agent Johnson, let's be very clear. You said a moment ago that you don't know where this woman was, right?
Correct. I couldn't tell you exactly where she was, Counselor. However, we have evidence that indicates who was there at the park the day of, and there's no indication that Lisa Clark was anywhere near.
I'm going to ask my question again. You don't know whether Lisa Clark was at that park, yes or no?
Objection, Your Honor. The question has been asked and answered.
I'm going to let him answer this one more time. Overruled.
Again, ma'am, we do have a pretty good idea of her not being at the park. There's no evidence to indicate as such.
Well, Agent Johnson, let's talk about somebody else. You also talked to people who worked at the park, right?
Correct.
You talked to 3 park employees?
Correct.
And for none of those people, were you able to find an alibi for where they were the night that Don Clark disappeared? Isn't that true?
No, ma'am. There are actually only 2 people. Oh, no, there's a third, Nate Garson. Yes, there were 3 people who didn't have alibis. Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Mr. Nybart,
Yes, Your Honor. Brief redirect.
you may.
Now, Agent Johnson, a few moments ago, Ms. Gaskins was asking you about Lisa Clark. Do you recall that?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Johnson, you mentioned that Lisa Clark had actually texted Mr. Clark right before she called him at 2:37 p.m.
Correct.
Would you recognize a copy of those text messages if I were to show them to you?
Absolutely.
Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 21, please? Now, Agent Johnson, what did Lisa Clark text Don Clark at 2:35 p.m. on August 18th?
She says here, I'm tired of the lawyers. Can we please resolve this on our own like adults?
And what time did they speak on the phone after that text message was sent?
Just a few seconds after.
Thank you, Agent. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. And Ms. Gaskins, I assume there's nothing further for this witness on a recross.
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you, Agent. You're free to leave. And Mr. Nybart, we're back with you in the government's case in chief.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government rests. We have no further witnesses to call.
All right. Ms. Gaskins, is the defense ready to begin its case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we call Joe Kwong to the stand.
Can you pronounce the witness's last name once more?
Kwong.
Kwong with an M?
K-U-A-N-G.
Kwong.
Yes.
Mr. Kwong, I'll remind you that you have been sworn prior to trial and that you're obligated to tell the truth under a penalty of perjury. And with that,
Yes, sir.
With that, Ms. Gaskins, you can proceed.
Hello. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Kwong.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Kwong?
I'm the founder, CEO, executive producer, and also the only employee at a film studio called Perfecto. I even got myself a shirt for branding.
What kind of films do you make?
Like the visionaries who came before me, the Ken Burnses of the world, if you will, I focus on documentaries. I think they're an emerging medium. Very exciting.
How did you get involved in this case?
Back in 2015, a woman named Cara Bassett reached out to me and asked me to help make a documentary about her elephant sanctuary in her life. We agreed to call it Elephant Queen. And for the next couple of years, I worked at her park every weekday to get footage.
What were your responsibilities when you were working at the park?
I was basically the eyes and the ears. From 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. basically every day, I'd follow Kara and her husband around. I'd follow the park staff. I'd videotape the elephants being fed, being cared for, videotape the tourists if anything interesting happened there. I was just collecting as much footage as I could.
How long did you get to work there?
About 2 years, ma'am. And I made the documentary for another year after that.
Were you able to get to know Kara Bassett and Don Clark pretty well?
Of course, every elephant queen must, of course, have an elephant king. I got to know Kara and Don pretty well through my interviews.
How would you describe their relationship?
It was pretty normal, very affectionate. You know, I'm a TV producer. If I can find drama, I love it. But overall, a really normal ups and downs, typical relationship.
Do you remember where you were on August 18th, 2018?
Yes, ma'am. Same place I was almost every weekday. I was at the sanctuary from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Were you able to see Don Clark that day?
I was. Actually, that was the last day I saw Don Clark.
Was there anything unusual about the interactions that you saw between Don Clark and Kara Bassett that day?
Not that I remember, ma'am. It was the same old Don and Kara.
Well, I want to ask you about Don Clark's relationship with somebody else. Was there anyone else that you saw come to the park frequently?
Oh, yes. Don's ex-wife, Lisa, was there a few times, and that right there, if she had been there more often, that would have been a major storyline in our documentary.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Kara and Don's relationship was pretty normal, pretty boring, but Lisa and Don, very, very hostile. I mean, I saw Don have to call the cops on Lisa once when she was threatening him and wouldn't get off the property.
What do you mean by Lisa Clark was threatening Don Clark?
Well, I remember she wasn't going away. She looked at Don and Lisa said, "I will wipe you off the face of the earth." Now, that woman was perfect for television.
Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to turn over to the FBI investigation in this case. When did you learn that they were investigating?
August 26th. So I saw Don on the 18th, went to Mexico for a week to meet some of my mentors in the film industry. Came back, and when I got back to the sanctuary, the place was swarming with the FBI.
What were they doing?
They were searching the facility. They were looking in the elephant troughs. They were going all over, taking notes.
Let me ask you, Mr. Kwong, at the time that the FBI comes to the park, how much footage did you have of Don Clark and Kara Bassett?
About 2,000 hours. Like I said, it's hard work putting a documentary together, and even harder to cut it down so you get as much footage as you can.
Well, did the FBI ever ask to see that footage?
No, ma'am. They didn't ask for that.
Did the government ever ask you any questions about the footage that you had of Don Clark?
No, ma'am. In fact, 60 Minutes asked me more questions than the FBI ever did.
And Mr. Kwong, I want to turn over to something else. Mr. Hudson, can you throw up exhibit the syringe for me, please? Are you familiar with the syringes in this case?
Yes, ma'am. Over my years at the park, I saw the park staff use them before.
What do you know about them?
I know that they're used to sedate the elephants if they get injured or if they're going under some sort of surgery. And I know that from what I saw, about a dozen different people could use them.
Did you ever see the FBI interacting with those syringes?
I did. I actually saw a couple of the junior agents. They were messing around with the tranquilizers. They were touching them with their bare hands.
Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to turn and really focus on Don Clark here. Were you able to get to know him well?
I was. Did a lot of standalone interviews with him. Wanted to understand his relationship with Kara. You know, motivations are really important when you're telling a story, and so I spent a lot of time around Don.
What did you learn?
I learned that he was all business when he was at the park, but after hours, he had his fun. He loved practical jokes, loved traveling. His favorite place to go was Costa Rica. He'd go there every couple of months.
Do you know where Don Clark would stay when he went to Costa Rica?
Yeah, I had his address.
Have you ever been there?
I did actually. In 2018, I went there to a week. I wanted to find some answers about Don myself.
When you went to Don Clark's house in Costa Rica, what happened?
Man, that was an adventure. So I got there, went to Don's place, door was locked. So I shimmied through the window like I was one of those bank heist movies. And when I got in there, I walked around and the place was spotless. No dust anywhere. I mean, the fan was running. I saw some of Don's clothes hanging in the closet.
After you saw some of Don's clothes hanging up in the closet, what happened next?
Oh, I decided I would go around and talk to the locals, see if any of them had spent any time around Don. It was a great chance for me to practice my conversational Spanish. I said, ¿Has visto este hombre? I had a picture of him. Have you seen this man?
Now, Mr. Kwong, I really want to focus on this Costa Rica thing. Mr. Hudson, can you throw up Exhibit 21 on the screen, what's already in evidence? Do you know what we're looking at here, Mr. Kwong?
Yes. Hold on. Let me just zoom in here. Looks like Don Clark's phone records.
I want to focus on the phone record for the call number 4. What can you tell us about this call?
So it looks like it was at 6 p.m. on the 18th, lasted almost an hour, and it was to a number in San Jose, Costa Rica.
Now, do you have any idea what Don Clark was doing at 6 p.m. on August 18th?
Yeah, he was talking to me.
What were you talking about?
We were at the sanctuary. I was wrapping up. I had to head to the airport, like I said, to go to Mexico, talking about my vacation. And then Don looked at something on his phone and his entire expression changed.
What do you mean?
Well, his face got all white. He looked nervous to me. He excused himself, and that was the last time I ever saw him.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Mr. Nybar?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed, Your Honor? Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to start right where you left off talking about Costa Rica. Now, you said you went to Costa Rica in 2018, right?
That's right. That was going to be a chapter in the documentary. Wanted to do some investigation of my own.
You went to see if Don Clark was in fact in Costa Rica, right?
I did.
And Mr. Kwong, you'd agree with me that you spoke to the police department in San Jose, right?
Yeah, I spoke to the locals, and then I spoke to the Costa Rican authorities. That's right.
Now, the police department in that area, they actually did an investigation to see if Don Clark was there, right?
They told me they had done...
lack of personal knowledge. May I be heard?
You may.
The question as phrased is that the police in Costa Rica did an investigation on Don Clark. That calls for this lay witness to speculate as to what the police department in Costa Rica was doing and what their missions were.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
I believe the witness does have the personal knowledge to testify to this fact. I can lay foundation that this witness spoke to the police department and learned that they did in fact conduct an investigation.
With that understanding, I'm going to allow you to ask some foundational questions. So for now, the objection is sustained, but you have the permission to lay a little bit of foundation that would be sufficient for the witness to testify, and you can re-ask the question, assuming you've laid that foundation.
Of course, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Kwong, when you went to Costa Rica, you made contact with the police department down there, right?
That's right. I reached out to them, asked them if they knew anything about where Don Clark was.
You spoke to them, right?
I did.
You found out that they conducted their own investigation, right?
That's what they told me, yes.
Mr. Kwong, you know that after conducting their own investigation, the Costa Rican Police Department didn't find any evidence that Don Clark was in Costa Rica. You know that, right?
Right. That's what the police said. Like I said, I did my own investigation. The locals told me they had seen him recently. But the police said that they had given up looking, I think, in 2017 itself, and they didn't find any trace of him.
That's right. The police found nothing, right?
And that's what they told me, yeah.
Mr. Kwong, I want to talk a little bit more about that documentary you mentioned a few moments ago. You were filming Kara Bassett and the Elephant Park starting in 2015, right?
That's right. Filming Kara, her husband, everything at the park.
That's right. You have over 2,000 hours of film from when you were filming, right?
Correct.
Mr. Kwong, you'd agree with me, you saw a lot about the elephant park while you were filming, right?
That's right. When you're at the park every day, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., you're going around the grounds, you see a lot of things.
You learned a lot about Dawn and Kara's relationship, right?
Of course.
You learned a lot about how Dawn and Kara disagreed about how that park should be run, right?
Yeah, they did have their back and forth about that. That's for sure.
Now, Dawn, he viewed the park as a business, right?
That's what Don always said, yeah.
You actually believe that Dawn, he was always business, right?
Yeah, when he was at the park 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, he was focused on the bottom line.
He cared about every penny, right?
That's right.
Dawn, he wanted to charge admission for people to see the elephants, right?
That's right.
He wanted the elephants to be in cages, right?
During the day, yes, sir.
He actually allowed people who came to the zoo to ride on the elephants too. He allowed that, right?
That's right. I think he thought that made it a prime tourist attraction.
Now, Mr. Kwong, you would agree with me that Kara Bassett, his wife, she had a different philosophy about that park, right?
Right. She saw the park as more of a sanctuary. She kind of wanted the elephants roam and free.
That's right. Kara Bassett didn't want a zoo. She wanted an animal sanctuary, right?
Yeah, personally, I mean, that sounds a little dangerous to me, just having the elephants running all over the place with those big old tusks, but that's what Kara wanted.
She wanted the animals to roam free, right?
That's right.
She didn't want people to touch the animals, right?
That's right.
She didn't want people to sit on top of the animals, right?
She said she thought that was cruel to let people ride them like they were mules.
Mr. Kwong, at that point, when Dawn and Kara argued about the elephant park, Dawn was in charge of the park, right?
That was my understanding, yeah, that Don and Kara ran it together, but Don was sort of the tiebreaker.
He got to make decisions, right?
I think so, yes.
He was in control.
It seemed like it.
Now, Mr. Kwong, you would agree with me that during the course of your documentary, you filmed some one-on-one interviews with Miss Bassett, right?
Right. I filmed one-on-ones with basically everyone and plenty of them with Kara.
Now, Mr. Kwong, you would agree with me that in one of those interviews, Miss Bassett told you that she would do anything to protect the elephants. She said that to you, right?
That's right. Like I said, she was very, very passionate about those animals.
Mr. Kwong, you would recognize that video in court today, right?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 38, please? Go ahead, Mr. Merle.
Objection, Your Honor. I ask that this be moved into evidence before it's played for the jury.
Okay, which exhibit is this?
Your Honor, this is Exhibit 38, and the government's fine with putting it to evidence at this moment.
So is the government offering it then, just to be clear for the record?
Yes, Your Honor.
And is there no objection?
There's no objection.
All right, it's admitted. You can play the video.
Mr. Merle? Mr. Merle, I believe we're having a trouble with the audio. Just a moment of the court's indulgence, Your Honor, while we figure out the technical difficulties. I apologize, Your Honor.
All right.
You know, working the cameras is always the hardest part of making a documentary, too.
We're all adjusting to it, Mr. Kwong.
Now you know my struggles.
Mr. Merle, any headway? I can move on if not, Mr. Merle. Just let me know. Your Honor, I believe Mr. Merle is now showing a transcript from that interview that Mr. Kwong had with Bassett. Mr. Kwong?
Mr. Nybart, I want to give you the leeway. If for some reason you're able to play it and you'd rather play it, here after you're done with this line of questioning, feel free to. I understand you're experiencing a tech issue, so it's your trial.
Of course, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Kwong, could you read that transcript for the members of the jury?
Sure. So Kara's on video talking about sort of political efforts and everything. She said, people look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on, keep underestimating me. I'll lobby senators, I'll protest big businesses, I'll get in your face, I'll take people to their graves if I have to. I'll do anything to protect these elephants.
Now, Mr. Kwong, in another video, Miss Bassett actually told you that nothing was more important to her than those elephants, right?
Right. That was taped right before. We just broke it up into two clips for different parts of the documentary.
That's right. In Exhibit 37, and Your Honor, again, I apologize. We don't have the video right now, but that's an exhibit in today's case. In Exhibit 37, Ms. Bassett told you, Mr. Kwong, that nothing was more important to her than
Again,
those-
Your Honor, objection. We do ask that Mr. Nybart moves these videos into evidence before he asks about testimony from the witness.
All right. Do you have any objection to their being admitted?
And no, Your Honor.
Then they're admitted. You can proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, in that exhibit, in that video, Ms. Bassett told you that nothing was more important than those elephants, right?
That's right. Like I said, she was very, very passionate about those animals and the way they were being treated.
And Mr. Kwong, I want to talk about what happened after Don Clark went missing in August of 2017. Now, sir, after he went missing, Ms. Bassett, she took control of the sanctuary, right?
That's right. She was in charge with Don gone.
She got to make the changes she wanted to see before, right?
That's right.
Now, that zoo, that elephant park, it became an animal sanctuary, right?
Yes. So people weren't allowed to ride the animals. We removed, cameramen included, kind of further away from the elephants. That's what happened.
Well, we'll get there, sir, but the zoo, it became an animal sanctuary, right?
Yes, sir.
It became a nonprofit, right?
Yes, sir. My understanding is it's actually made more money as a nonprofit than before. So a good business decision there.
So that's a yes, it became a nonprofit, right?
Yes, sir.
The elephants, they weren't in cages anymore.
No, sir.
People that couldn't ride the elephants anymore, right?
All right. Like I said, everyone was moved further away from the animals.
And Mr. Kwong, you would agree with me that all of these changes happened just after months Don Clark went missing, right?
Right. A couple of months after Don went missing, we started to see those changes happen.
Thank you, Mr. Kwong. No further questions, Your Honor. Again, apologies to the court about the technical difficulties.
No problem. Ms. Gaskins, anything further?
No, Your Honor, no redirect.
Okay. Mr. Kwong, thank you for your time. You're excused.
Thank you, sir.
Anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor, we rest our case in chief and we're ready for closing arguments.
Okay. The government, I'm going to ask the government to proceed with closing. Is there anything the government wants to take up before that?
Your Honor, could the government just have a moment to ensure that all sort of technical difficulties are sorted out before we begin summations?
Sure. Let's give a couple minutes, 2 minutes. We'll start back at 12:55 p.m. Eastern.
Yes, Your Honor.
And counsel, I don't know if you can hear me. I've been told that if you want to play a video, assuming there's one in evidence that you'd like to use during argument, whoever is playing it has to have their microphone unmuted, and perhaps the witness who was using it might have to have theirs unmuted, and perhaps that was the issue we were facing. So,
Thank you, Your Honor.
okay, back online. Is the United States ready to proceed?
We are, Your Honor.
And the jury's with you, Mr. Nybart.
Your Honor, Ms. Gaskins, members of the jury. There have been a lot of things said from the beginning to the end of today's trial, but there's one moment I want you to focus on in particular. Mr. Merle, can we see Exhibit 38, please? Again, Your Honor, I believe we're having some technical difficulties. Apologies to the court. But members of the jury, in this video, like Mr. Kwong told you a few moments ago, Miss Bassett looked right into the camera. And she said, I will do anything to protect these elephants. I will take people to the grave if I have to. Members of the jury, those were the defendant's own words. And we know that's exactly what she did on August 18th of 2017. Because for years, Dawn and Kara, they argued about that elephant park. For years, Kara wanted Dawn to make some changes. For years, Kara wanted control. She wanted to make decisions. But members of the jury, throughout today's trial, we've learned that time and time again, Kara was ignored. Kara was dismissed by her husband, and members of the jury, the defendant finally had enough. She made a plan to get her husband out of the picture, a plan to murder Dawn Clark. And on August 18th of 2017, she followed through with that plan. On that day, she killed her own husband. And members of the jury, that's why as the government, we charged Miss Bassett with murder. Now, all we had to prove is that Kara Bassett killed Dawn Clark and did so because she possessed some ill will or hatred towards him. And we had to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, members of the jury, I want to be clear about what that means. Because a reasonable doubt's not just a possible doubt. It's not just an imaginary doubt. It's a doubt that grabs your attention. It's a doubt you can't ignore. So picture you and your family are going on a vacation. You pack up your car, you're pulling out of your driveway, but you stop. You ask yourself, is the TV still on in the living room? Is the stove still on in the kitchen? Well, members of the jury, if you go back inside and you check, that's a doubt that grabs your attention. If you go back inside and you check, that's a doubt you can't ignore. If you go back inside and you check, that's a reasonable doubt. And members of the jury, we've left you with no doubt that grabs your attention. We've left you with no doubt you can't ignore. Because we've shown you how and why the defendant committed this crime. So first, the how. Well, today you heard that on August 18th of 2017 in the evening, Kara and Dawn were alone at the elephant park. So the defendant, she had to be resourceful. She didn't have a gun, a baseball bat, she didn't have a knife on hand, but she did have one thing. One thing we heard today was extremely deadly. A syringe filled with elephant tranquilizer. A syringe the defendant had access to, a syringe she used to kill her husband. Members of the jury, after she killed Dawn Clark, what was the next step? Well, now it was time for the cover-up. She had to dispose of his body. So the defendant puts her husband's body in the back of a van as she drives it miles and miles away to get rid of it. And members of the jury, how do we know that? Well, we have GPS records from the night of August 18th. Mr. Merle. We know that after 11 o'clock on August 18th of 2017, Kara Bassett left the elephant park. We know that close to 1:30. On that same day, she arrived at Big Gum Swamp to get rid of her husband's body. Now, members of the jury, the defense wants you to believe that Miss Bassett never went to that swamp and never got rid of her husband's body. Members of the jury, don't be fooled. Because today you heard about Exhibit 29. These are Miss Bassett's boots, the defendant's own boots that had mud and algae on them that matched the same mud and algae from Big Gum Swamp. Members of the jury, we know exactly where the defendant was on that evening. We know exactly how she committed this crime. But what about the why? Why did Miss Bassett kill her own husband? Well, members of the jury, that answer is simple. The defendant finally had enough. You heard that for years. Miss Bassett argued with Don Clark. You heard that for years. She wanted changes. She wanted to take control. She wanted to make decisions. Members of the jury, you heard that Don Clark would never listen to his wife. And so think about Exhibit 37. Mr. Kwong read that transcript for us a few moments ago. We don't have the video, members of the jury, but think about what it said. Nothing is more important to me than these elephants. Nothing. Members of the jury, so when Miss Clark saw her husband mistreating the elephants, letting people ride on them, letting people go up and touch them, well, she had to take matters into her own hands. The defendant, she finally had enough. That's why she killed Don Clark. But if you're still not convinced, if you still agree with Miss Gaskins, if you still think Miss Bassett didn't commit this crime, I want you to think about Exhibit 34. Mr. Morrow. The defendant told her husband, "Let me run the park my way or I'm going to kill you." Members of the jury, it doesn't get any clearer than that. The defendant finally had enough. Hold her accountable. Find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nybart. Ms. Gaskins, for the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. When Mr. Nybart tells you that Miss Bassett finally had enough, for a moment you may be compelled, but when you think about it, it doesn't actually prove anything. I mean, think about it. Over and over again in today's trial, Mr. Nybart has been trying to convince you that one, Don Clark is dead, and that two, Kara Bassett is the one that killed him with an elephant tranquilizer. And now just because he says something over and over again doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean that he proved it. And surely doesn't make it sound any less absurd. I mean, think about it. Did he really prove to you that Don Clark is even dead? Is it possible that Don Clark could be alive in Costa Rica somewhere? Sure. And the reason that you don't really have the answers to the questions that you asked is because the government didn't prove their case. You see, when the government came into court today, they were the ones who had the highest burden in our criminal justice system. They have to prove to you that this woman, Miss Bassett, murdered her own husband. They had to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through all of the ways that the government failed to meet that burden. First, we're going to talk about how Miss Bassett didn't commit this crime. Second, we're going to talk about what else could possibly be true. And third, we're going to talk about how the government failed to investigate any of those other possibilities. So first, how Miss Bassett didn't commit this crime. It was the government's burden and their burden alone to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Bassett intentionally and deliberately killed her own husband. But out of the witnesses, out of the testimony, out of the evidence that you heard today, nothing told you that Miss Bassett was ever violent with her husband the day he disappeared. Nothing told you that they ever fought the day that he disappeared. Nobody was able to take the stand and tell you that they saw Miss Bassett in that van that Mr. Nybart thinks is so important. Nobody could even take the stand today and tell you that they saw this woman in the boots that Mr. Nybart claims have this algae on it. And members of the jury, while we're on the point of algae, I want to talk about something that Mr. Nybart is actually hiding from you. Mr. Hudson, can you throw up on the screen for us that forensic report? You see, members of the jury, Mr. Nybart will have you believe that that algae on Miss Bassett's boots proves something, proves that she was there at that swamp to dump her husband's body, but no. What he won't tell you is the fact that the government, they failed to ever even test a single thing on her own property for that same type of algae. So ask yourself, is it possible that one of the swamps or the watering holes or the natural bodies of water on this 5,000-foot property could have had that same type of algae on it? Absolutely. You see, the government, they want you to make this leap in logic. They want you to see, oh, Miss Bassett and her husband, they got into arguments. They didn't agree on how to run the park. So Miss Bassett's a cold-blooded killer. But members of the jury, what the government doesn't seem to understand is that married couples fight. Heated arguments, sometimes it's normal. If we put wives on trial every time they had an argument with their husbands, we'd have a backlog in our criminal justice system to last the rest of our lives. So when he asks you to make assumptions, that's when you have to remember, that's not how this works. That's when you have to presume that Miss Bassett is innocent. So let's move to the biggest unanswered question in this case. Where is Dawn Clark? You were listening for the answer to that question throughout the government's entire case, and you still haven't heard the answer, and here's why that's a problem. There's no autopsy. There's no forensic report. There's no blood. There's no body. There's nothing proving that this man is actually dead. In fact, you have evidence on the record to suggest to you otherwise. Joe Kwong's testimony, look back at it. He went to Costa Rica. He saw clothes in the closet. He saw a clean house. It's possible. So let's move to what the government did about this contradicting evidence. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Let's start with the lead investigator on this case, Agent Johnson. I made sure to ask Agent Johnson these important questions on cross-examination, and if you were listening carefully, he was having a hard time answering them. Because there are alternate possibilities here. Let's start with these park employees. There were multiple park employees who didn't have an alibi for where they were the night that Dawn Clark disappeared. And Lisa Clark, don't even get me started. His ex-wife that was known to be threatening Dawn Clark in the months up to his disappearance won't even cooperate and answer any questions of the police. Is that suspicious? Yes. Did the government even bother to further investigate that? Ask any questions? No. And that's because they chose their answer before they asked the questions. So I ask that you come to the only conclusion that the evidence supports and the law requires. Find Miss Bassett not guilty of murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gaskins. Mr. Nybart.
Rebuttal, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Members of the jury, Ms. Gaskins wants you to focus on 3 questions, so let's take a look at them. Mr. Merle, can we see them, please? Now, members of the jury, Ms. Gaskins actually had 3 questions when she came up here and talked to you before, and she said there could have been another individual responsible for this crime. Members of the jury, on cross-examination, Ms. Gaskins asked Agent Johnson, where was Lisa Clark? Did you find evidence that Lisa Clark was at the Elephant Park and Agent Johnson told you no? Ms. Gaskins wants you to think that we don't know where Dawn Clark's body is, and yes, we didn't find Dawn Clark's body, but we have the GPS records. Ms. Bassett went to Big Gum Swamp, disposed of her husband's body, and submerged it underwater, and members of the jury, we know that because of her boots. We know that Miss Bassett's boots were at Big Gum Swamp on the night of August 18th. Members of the jury, we're not asking you to make any leaps in logic. These aren't reasonable doubts. Miss Gaskins just wants you to doubt your own reason. Don't do it. You know that the defendant, she finally had enough. Find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nybart. Assuming there's nothing further from either attorney, is that correct? All right, then I will charge the jury to go back and deliberate and to apply their own reason and logic to the evidence that you've presented and the arguments that you've made. And I'm going to ask our jury to take 1 minute to complete and submit their ballots. I'm going to do the same, so I'm going to turn my camera off for a minute, and I'll ask that everyone stay on the call until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we will do brief comments. So we'll take 1 minute. We'll be right back.